Welcome back to the session, everybody. And now I'd like to introduce Adam and Daniel. Over to you.
All right, we're up live. Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending the Photo Studio Ops Forum. I'm Daniel Jester, Chief Evangelist for Creative Force and host of the e-commerce content creation podcast. And joining me is my good friend and colleague, Adam Parker. Say hi, Adam.
Hello, everyone.
Our session today is talking all about flow production for the modern studio. And I posted a thing on LinkedIn. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I posted a thing to ask some people to think about some things in preparation for this session. What does their process look like, and what are those dependencies in that process? And I asked that for a specific reason that we're going to get into. But I think to start off this session, I got to kick it over to Adam, because we got to find out, what do we mean when we say flow production? What are we talking about when we say flow production, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. And even before that, I think it'd be great for us to share a little bit of an agenda. I always appreciate it to know what we're going to be talking about today overall. And one of those things, obviously, is flow production. What is it? Why should you care? How does it relate to photo studios in general? We're also going to be talking a lot about bottlenecks, what those mean, how we define them in this context, how to reduce bottlenecks, which everyone probably wants to do, as well as how to protect bottlenecks, which might sound a little antithetical. Why would you want to protect a bottleneck? But Daniel can speak pretty well to that. And then my favorite part is, okay, now what? We're going to throw a lot of ideas out here, but we want you to be able to walk away from this with actionable things you can take back to your studio tomorrow and affect positive change within your studio. So that's what we'll be covering today. I'm going to go ahead and take this down, actually. We can all just talk like friends here. So yeah, when we talk about flow production, before we even get into everything, let's discuss what exactly does that mean. I think a lot of people are already familiar with the concept of flow production without really even knowing it. It's sometimes referred to as continuous production, and it's a methodology that's really usually associated with manufacturing, Henry Ford and assembly lines and this sort of thing. But it has a ton of resonance with studio photography and creative production that I think is really valuable. So we could do an entire TED talk on flow production. I couldn't, I'm definitely not that smart, but one could. But instead, with our limited amount of time, we're going to zero into a couple of key components that are really important when we talk about studio production. So one of the real kind of tenets of flow production is it centers around continually pushing objects in production in a studio. This is images. This is samples, whatever we traffic in our studios. Pushing those things as soon as possible to the next step in their production life cycle. We don't let things stack up in one step in the process and then in a batch, move them all to the next step in the process. As soon as something's ready, we move it right along that digital or production assembly line. So that's one of the real key components. And we'll come back later to why that's so valuable and all the kinds of opportunity and value that unlocks. One of the other main components is not letting things stack up in those individual steps. So we break a process off into many small repeatable steps. So we make a long assembly line process of repeatable steps, and we don't let things get caught in that process, stacking up and creating bottlenecks. One of the ways that this is really valuable is it's really friendly to automation, right? When you get these repeatable individual steps, you get things that become automatable, where think about retouching, knocking out a background, say. That's something that no creative necessarily wants to do. You're not adding any value by having a person do that. So why not automate it? And so all along this process, from sample receipt to photography to retouching, when we break it out into small repeatable steps, it becomes automation friendly. So there's a ton of opportunity here. It also reduces waste. And by having that string of repeatable steps, it introduces more opportunities for QA all along that process. So that's going to reduce waste downstream. It's going to improve consistency, speed up production, and overall just be kind of supercharge your studio's production capabilities. So yeah, breaking things up into those little repeatable steps and not letting things get caught and bottlenecked in those repeatable steps are two kind of zoomed in versions of flow production that are really valuable to photo studios. Daniel, maybe you could speak a little bit about bottlenecks and how you can reduce those things within the photo studio.
Yeah, so like Adam was saying, you have many of you on this in this session already are familiar with this. You wouldn't ask your photographers to unpack a product and prep it and assemble it and get it ready for shooting. And I say assemble, I'm a hard lines photography guy, so that's, you know, part of my world there. But you already are familiar with this. You're taking down individual tasks, you're breaking them up into pieces, and then you're moving things through the line. And what that creates automatically sort of is areas that become bottlenecks or funnels within your studio. And what we talked about before is you need to be able to identify what your bottlenecks are, and then you need to identify whether or not they're adding any value or if they're even necessary. A lot of times a bottleneck can point to some added complexity in a process that sometimes means that was put into place to solve a specific problem with the production process. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment. But if you think about like the photography step, you have a certain number of sets in your studio, and each set has the capacity to handle a certain number of products in a day. That inherently creates a bottleneck. So we pivot from saying, is this bottleneck necessary? Yes, the photography step in a studio is absolutely necessary. To how can we protect this bottleneck? Meaning, how can we keep that pipeline open as big as possible without adding tasks that make that pipeline smaller and smaller and smaller? Everything that you ask your photography team on set to do above and beyond just snapping those images and moving them in the process has the potential to make that bottleneck smaller and affect your throughput. But more importantly, and this is going to seem maybe a little out of left field for the session, but more importantly, you're creating sort of almost a mental bottleneck for your team in some ways by having them do things that are called task switching. Adding more tasks and more things for a person in a particular step to do actually has an impact on their mental ability to complete those steps. And I know this sounds super like I did too much yoga this morning or something, but this is true. This is a real thing. In the book Scrum, there's this idea about task switching and what it can do to people. And Adam, am I too early for us to bring up the visual aid on this thing? Or
no, let's do
did I
it.
get ahead of myself? Yeah. Okay. So we're getting into task switching. Why is this such a problem? And why is this so important to understand as a matter of protecting your bottleneck? There's an exercise in the book Scrum by J.J. Sutherland, which I highly recommend. Buy this book, read this book. There's a lot of really great actionable things in this book that can help you understand this. But one of the things that has always stood out to me was this idea and this exercise to illustrate task switching. So here's what the exercise is. You're going to take 3 sets of characters, numbers, Roman numerals, and letters, 1 through 10, A through L, and 1 through 10 in Roman numerals. And what you're going to do is you're going to write them across in a row. You're going to write the number first, then the letter, then the Roman numeral. Move down to the next row, write it out again, and keep going down until you get all the way to 10. I'm not going to do this with you right now, but in the book, they illustrate having done this, and it takes about 39 seconds to complete this process, going row by row as you go down. Now, by just changing our process a little tiny bit, we're going to do the exact same thing, 1 through 10, A through L, 1 through 10, but this time we're going to write it out in columns. So we're going to write all of the numbers first, then all of the letters, and then all of the Roman numerals. And you'll find consistently, I've done this dozens of times, you will probably experience being able to do it in half the time that you did it before, even when you're doing it your fastest at every step. And that's simply because you're not task switching. You're not mentally moving from numbers to letters to Roman numerals and having to rebuild this sort of mental construct to understand where you are contextually in each of those processes. We genuinely and scientifically, we lose time when we're asked to do this type of task switching. Now, if you think about what that means in your photo studio, your photographer is there to solve some photographic problems. If they're a non-figure photographer, they're there with the model, really, being photographers, being great photographers, but maintaining a relationship and a level of energy with the model. Even a hard lines product tabletop photographer is saying they're trying to solve those problems. The minute you come to them with a, hey, there's an image missing, or hey, I have this other thing, or they have to switch tasks to think about, okay, now I need to get these images where they're supposed to go, that takes away from their ability to do the other job as effectively as they were doing it before. So this is one of the ways when we talk about protecting bottlenecks, really protecting the roles of each of those steps of the process, because task switching costs us a lot and it's almost invisible in a studio.
Yeah, and I would add on to that by saying that that concept that you just talked about is one of the reasons that I think this is a valuable philosophy when we're talking about creative production, because it's really easy to, I think, bristle at the idea of an assembly line. When we talk about creative work, it's easy to think, hey, that's not the way my studio works. You know, we have a brand that's really important. We need things to look good. This is not an assembly line. But in reality, it is an assembly line, and we can automate all of the things that aren't necessary and have the creative work done by creatives. And if they're able to focus on that creative work and not get sucked into this task switching, we're doing the creatives a favor. We're getting the most creative value out of their work, and we're automating all the stuff that can be automated. So it's again a little antithetical, but it's actually really helpful to adopt this kind of process where you're protecting your creatives and still maintaining really efficient production. So I think I completely agree, Daniel.
And we should also just, extend it to all parts of the production process, samples, teams, and inbound and outbound as well. The more that you can protect those bottlenecks by keeping them focused on the things that truly add value to the customer, the better off your production process is going to be. And truly, the happier I think your team is going to be. People like being problem solvers, but there's no photographer or stylist out there who just loves trying to figure out which image they named wrong, or if they put the garment on the wrong rack, those things. And I guess what I'm kind of advocating for here is have one person in your studio whose job it is to solve those kinds of problems that floats around from station to station. But that's getting too advanced for this entry level conversation on flow production.
And to add on to that, we did promise some takeaways and some things that people can actually enact. And so I think we should talk a little bit more about reducing bottlenecks, right? And how different ways you can achieve that. I don't think we have time, and I'm not going to show charts on a presentation like this. I'm not a sadist, but there's a ton of reporting, especially if you have modern and advanced software that can really help you see where these bottlenecks are happening, show you cycle times within your studio, and really expose where things are stacking up along that assembly line within your studio to help you reduce bottlenecks. And then the next question becomes why? Why are things stacking up? And that's where it starts to get, if you're a nerd, fun. That's where it starts to get fun, where you get to do some problem solving. And I think one of the things, Daniel, when we talked about this, was one of the best ways to reduce bottlenecks being reducing dependencies, right? Like bottlenecks happen because of dependencies. Something can't move to the next stage in its process because it's dependent on some other action. A art director needs to approve something, so things stack up until that art director approves them. Some bottlenecks are obviously maybe necessary, but reducing them should absolutely be a North Star goal.
Yeah, a great example of this from a studio that I worked at is in a bottleneck that we determined that we could absolutely remove from the entire process. And part of this was just having some insight into what was going on a little bit. And so, like Adam said, understanding your production flow and what's going on in your studio and having reporting and data to back up some of these theories that you may have is really important. And I'll get through it as quickly as I can here. We had a process. It was a photography studio. We shot mostly hard lines there. And we had a process where every product that came off of set would go to a Digitech, Digitech's a little bit of a misnomer for this role. It was really more of a QA person, but their job was to scan every product that came off of set and check those images in our internal DAM system, make sure that all of those images were present and accounted for, technical specs were met, that everything looked good. And what that represented in the studio was an obvious bottleneck. We had about 300 square feet of space where product would stack up because we had 3 photography sets that were feeding to one Digitech, and this became an obvious bottleneck, and those images couldn't move on in the process until they went through this one place. And we were just thinking, is this necessary? How do we know if this is necessary? I don't even know I don't remember how the conversation came up, but it wasn't my decision or our studio's decision alone. I know there was other studios involved in working through this. But what we discovered is that we had also decided to implement this thing called a kickout card. And in my studio, a kickout card meant that anytime a product didn't follow along the normal process that was expected, if it went backwards a step, if it had to get rerouted, the person who made that change or made that move had to fill out a kickout card explaining why it was being moved. This went to the wrong place, or this turns out it can't be shot here, it has to be shot somewhere else, all of that kind of stuff. We logged all of these kickout cards. And one of the things that we had the Digitech at the QA step do was kick those cards back to the photography step. And if they were missing images, we wanted to be able to know how often missing images and that sort of thing came up. what we discovered is that this QA step, 95% of the time, there was nothing actionable for this QA person to do. 95% of the time, they were just checking images, thumbs up, sending it on its way. And 5% of the time, it was simply just missing or misnamed images, like most of the time. So we thought, like, can we just get rid of this bottleneck? Are we willing to accept maybe 5% of images being missing or misnamed in order to save ourselves 300 square feet of studio space and potentially a half a day of turnaround time, because once they come off of photography, they go straight to the next step in the process instead of stacking up in this bottleneck. And collectively, we decided that this was acceptable to us. We were going to accept potentially 5% of images having one of these issues, but we were going to mitigate that a little bit by moving some of the QA step up to the photographer. So the photographers now had, and again, I know I just evangelized about task switching. I get this. There's a reason that we had to do it this way. But we moved some of that QA step up to the photographer. Hey, just double check and make sure that everything you expect to be there is there for that product before you move on. Now, if we had had a tech solution, something like Creative Force, that doesn't allow you to complete the photography step until all images are accounted for, that would have completely solved that problem. But you can clearly see what we did here. We identified a huge bottleneck, did a little bit of risk reward analysis to say, are we willing to accept some things that are wrong in order to save ourselves a ton of space and 12 hours of lead time? And then on top of that, we broke down to a much smaller problem, which is we have this problem where sometimes images are misnamed or missing entirely. We can now apply, maybe there's a technology solve to apply specifically to that one small problem, instead of adding this entire QA step just to catch those handful of things. And so that's what you really want to think about when you're thinking about bottlenecks in your studio. Where are they totally unnecessary, or where are they not adding value to the customer, and where do they have to exist, and how can we protect them? And that's, I guess that's the crux of the entire conversation that we wanted to have today, right? We should probably move into, we've delivered our message. Now what? I'll also say this is a rich topic. Adam and I are going to record a podcast episode about this topic to dig a little bit deeper into some of these things. Hopefully it'll be coming out sooner rather than later. But yeah, we have our now what slide, and then we can get into some questions.
Yeah, and I'll also shamelessly plug that I've written a photo studio KPI and reporting guide that's being published by Creative Force that also has a chapter on this subject as well. So there's a lot more content out there. Also, Daniel and I are nerds who would love to talk to you about this in person if you want to reach
anytime.
out. So do that. Okay, now what? What are we going to do with all the information that we discussed today? I think it's a little bit, this is an obvious one, but you have to be willing to try if you want to affect some of these kinds of changes within your studio. And I think the sub point here is actually more important, that willing to try does mean willing to fail. This kind of failure should be encouraged. Daniel, I think this might have been your phrase, but I really liked it, which was, in a studio, there are very few one-way doors. You can try something. You can pilot a new process on one set within one product category. You can pilot a new vendor for this one section of photography. There's so many things that you can try that aren't going to completely screw you if you didn't go ahead and try them. There are very few one-way doors. Encourage trying things, encourage failure, fail fast, and learn from your mistakes there. Mistakes is not even the right word. And again, this is one that I'm really partial to, which is that testing, iteration, and these continuous marginal gains, they're going to win out over big sweeping changes pretty much every time. These little things are going to add up exponentially. And if you have this culture of continuous marginal gains, it's going to be a complete winner.
No step Daniel can be sacred. Yeah, everything that we do is about creating an image to sell that product online. And every way that we break out that process is in service of that greater goal. I think, Adam, you wrote it really perfectly here. The output of our work is the entire point, not the process of how we get there. What I mean by that is you have to be willing to put things sort of on the chopping block. Someday there's going to be an ability to not have to have a team full of steamers in a studio steaming garments. We have to be willing to not consider garment steaming a sacred part of the process, but it's something that we can evaluate and change as technology catches up with the work that we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to that other point, that every step that we do save needs to have value. And to wrap things up, it seems obvious, but you need to have a technology that supports all of these approaches and all of these things that we discussed. That's just enough said. It's a no-brainer. You need to have tools in place that support these ways of working and that don't break when you want to try different things, and that have many of these things built and baked into them already. So that would be my my big suggestion as well.
All right, that's it for us. And I think we've just got a little tiny bit of time left. So I don't know if there's any questions that can be.
I don't think we actually do have questions in this section.
All right, well, if that's it, thanks for listening to us. I hope you got something out of it. And we'll see you in the next session.